Hello and welcome to this week's episode. I'm Ben Maloney.
I'm Hugh McCarran.
And I'm Faye Lenner.
Come take a seat with us on the Mockery cushion as we discuss the preposterous and unpredictable life of Lord Timothy Dexter.
So Ben, who is Lord Timothy Dexter?
Well, he was an American, I suppose you could say, businessman, born in 1747, so lived mostly in the 18th century. And a lot of people have referred to him as America's richest idiot, America's luckiest idiot. And there's sort of debate over whether he was that or whether he was a genius that's kind of been misunderstood for his whole life. But he was born in Massachusetts Bay, which was one of the crown colonies in British America back in the 18th century. He was probably born into a poor or relatively, I guess, working class family, and dropped out of school at the age of 8, so very young, to
8.
work. Age of 8, yeah. So it was pretty early on
Sure,
in
early
the
dropout.
process. Yeah.
Yeah, what would he have learned by age 8?
I don't know what they were taught in 18th century
Probably more
schools
than we
anyway.
learn in our whole education, but
Yeah, probably.
these
Yeah,
days.
yeah. At the age of 8,
Dropped
he
out.
dropped out of school, and it was to do manual labour on a farm. So he was getting into just doing manual work, and by the age of about I mean, I've seen conflicting reports actually, but between 14 and 16, so as a young teenager, he became an apprentice leather dresser. And that was a good choice at the time because although it was considered like a lower class job, really, it was he was working with Moroccan leather, which was in high demand. Basically, it was the height of fashion at that point, and there was money in the business. So he obviously knew what he was trying to do. So he went then into business producing leather gloves and breeches as well. He got into a little bit of trouble, or all industry really got into a bit of trouble when in 1773, May of 1773, you might have heard of something called the Boston Tea Party, which was an incident when British rule in the area imposed something called taxation without representation, basically, which would allow the East India Trading Company, which is obviously a British-based company in the colonies, to sell tea exported or imported from China without paying as much tax on it. But the American patriots, the local patriots, opposed this whole thing. And what happened was the Boston Tea Party, where they went to the ports, they boarded the ships, the trading company ships, and just threw all of these chests of tea into the ocean, into the harbour, in a form of protest, essentially. And that caused a bunch of unrest, civil unrest, and lack of business and so on. So basically, the government closed the ports, which is why the jobs were dwindling. But Dexter decided to stay local. He moved to Charlestown. By the way, the area of Massachusetts that he's in is called Ipswich, not the English one. And he moved to Charlestown, basically just, I was going to say armed with, but possessing a bindle, the little sticks which you have over your shoulder, which have all your belongings in. So
Like a little cartoon.
That's
yeah,
the
like
cliche of the
like a
cartoons.
little cartoon animal.
Yeah.
Like he probably had like a little picnic blanket that's like a
A
red
red
check
spotty
white
one.
spots.
or
Yeah.
spots, yeah.
Yeah.
I think he got into some trouble, maybe crossed some kind of officer, I forget, but basically he wound up in Ipswich jail because he almost got into a duel, and I think he tried to shoot this guy and missed or something. Anyway, wound up in Ipswich jail, and then he had to move away to avoid confrontation.
Wow.
But basically, when he was living there, he met his future wife, Elizabeth Frothingham, who was a rich widow as of recently at the time. So basically, he married into wealth. She was 10 years older than him, newly rich, and he bought some land and he set up a leather shop for himself from their house, basically.
Can I just insert a little bit about one of the first jobs, where he was the informer of deer?
Dexter is an interesting character in the sense that he's always thinking about how other people perceived him, and he wants to be seen as an equal with the likes of his upper class neighbours. Remember, he's living in a rich area now, so the likes of John Hancock and Thomas Russell and people are living just down the road, and he wants to fit in with the nobility, and he's married into money, so he wants to prove his worthiness by basically making his own money. So when he saw that everybody else had places in public office, and that's how they were respected, upper class people. Yeah, as you say, he wanted a position on the council.
Yeah. So he submitted loads of petitions to the governing body, and finally they caved in, and they created a post for him called the Informer of Deer.
Yeah, in the animal.
Yes. And then under the title, Timothy Dexter was required to keep track of the town's fawn population, although the local records show that, quote, that the last deer had disappeared from the Malden Woods 19 years before.
Yeah.
Oh,
exactly.
so they just created a job to keep him occupied.
Just to keep him busy, basically.
Yeah, a fake occupation that he could sit on the council, but not actually do anything or have any say.
He must have really got on their nerves.
Yeah, I imagine he took it quite seriously anyway, but when you hear a bit more about him, you'll see why people weren't so keen on him at first. So basically, he set about then to find what I like to call Dexterian ways of multiplying his wealth. And so he was famed kind of for making very, very strange, I guess, nonsensical decisions about investments that nobody else believed would create return, and they always did. Everything worked out for him. That's why people call him America's luckiest idiot. But there's the argument that he actually knew what he was doing the whole time. So his first venture was... there was a currency at the time called the Continental Dollar, and it was the first form of paper currency after the Revolutionary War had happened. And it was created by the Continental Congress, which is an organisation found by the colonies, essentially to counter British rule. So it was a patriot foundation. And they decided to issue $250 million worth of these continental bills. But basically, it didn't really work because people refused to accept the bills because they didn't trust the value of them, because they were, this newly printed currency. And so it was undermined and devalued. And they issued more and more of these things. And by 1779, basically, it took you to have $40 worth of paper bills just to equal $1 in wealth. So they were pretty worthless, these things. In fact, they used the phrase "not worth a continental" was a way of saying something was worthless.
That's still said today, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's still in use.
Is it?
And so basically, what Hancock and Russell started doing was buying these things back just in order to boost public confidence in the currency, and they basically saw it as a charitable gesture. But obviously, Dexter saw them do this, and he thought, here's a way maybe I could earn some respect because these are the people he admires. So he emulates them by buying these bills as well. But actually, rather than doing it as a charitable gesture, he spent the entire of his fortunes, like the entire of his savings from the leather shop and his wife's savings, on just buying this worthless currency. Like probably the biggest gamble you could possibly make and he's buying them for like fractions of pennies on the dollar, so he can buy loads of these things. And then when the Constitution was revised following Alexander Hamilton's changes or ratifications in the 1790s, Continentals, they decided, could be traded in for treasury bonds at 1% of the face value. So Dexter basically became instantly rich, or astronomically rich, because all of these dollars he bought were now treasury bonds. So and also he'd been flipping European currency that he bought for a profit as well. And bearing in mind, I know.
How the heck did he know?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
they were eventually going to be worth something. Did he? Was it a hunch?
Maybe he's from the future.
Yeah,
maybe.
I don't know whether these were just crazy gambles. I mean, a lot of what he did was basically acting on advice which neighbours that didn't like him had given him maliciously, that just happened to...
Yeah. But I suppose, he was purchasing this basically worthless currency for hardly any money. I'm guessing he didn't spend much overall then when he bought this currency.
No, I think he. This is the thing: is he was buying. I think he spent everything on them because he was buying so many of the things.
Okay.
But obviously, because they're so cheap, he'd bought
like
enormous amounts of them.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, I mean, we were saying yesterday, it's sort of like something from Brewster's Millions. You know, he's making these enormous gambles just to see if they pay off, which they seem to always. Yeah. They always seem to. So apparently, Dexter's temperament as a person, he was eccentric, crude. Apparently had a distasteful nature and inability to keep his mouth shut at inopportune moments. He was someone who probably made a lot of impulsive decisions.
And although that he wanted to be accepted by the elites, his personality and his interests didn't work in his favour. No,
not at all. Even after these money-making schemes, they still his attitude prevented him from breaking into, I guess, what you could call the upper crust. He pretty much put this down to the kind of unwilling, stodgy nature of the people from Boston, or near Boston, where he was living. So basically, he gathered together his family. I think by this point he had 2 kids and his belongings and his wife as well, and moved on to the northern coastal town Newburyport, which is where he became famous for living. And that's where he bought the Dexter house, or the Dexter mansion, which was an enormous, lavishly decorated mansion, and that had lots of land as well. Basically, he bought a whole estate, and Newburyport was like the ideal town for him to flourish, basically. So he had a sea view from the house, and with his new fortune, he built a fleet of ships, horses, apparently a coach with his initials engraved on it. And he hired architects. This is the best bit, actually. He hired architects to carve 40 statues, giant stone statues, of the greatest figures in American contemporary politics and history, and also figures from Native American history, European history, antiquity, and so on. All the great minds, the people that he admired. And right in the middle of it all was a statue of himself, which just about sums up what he was like. And there was an inscription under the statue that read, I am the first in the East, the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world. So high
And
opinions of
supposedly
himself.
the man had never read a book on philosophy
Yeah,
in
I
his
mean,
life.
possibly even any book. I mean, he dropped out of school
Yeah.
at the age of 8. I mean, as we'll find out
Yeah.
soon, he could probably barely read. But anyway, these statues, by the way, cost him twice the actual house. So his wife got increasingly embarrassed with all of this, and I think she eventually just left him to live elsewhere. And his son moved in. His son was basically a drunk. His daughter was pretty mad. I think she's like clinically insane. And at that point, they turned the mansion into essentially like a brothel um, or a party. Basically, it's sort of like an 18th century Playboy mansion with drunken antics and parties, music, all sorts of stuff going on.
I'd like
And
to know what
apparently,
a
I'd like to know what a Dexter party was like. I wonder
well,
if
yeah, and
there
I'd like to know
were.
what kind of music you'd have in an 18th century Playboy mansion.
It'd be literally be like a Peter Seymour Bach choir after party, wouldn't it?
Yeah, we'd
Rob
Robin
and
definitely
Dasser
that in
doing
the
"Come If You
podcast.
Dare" in the corner.
Yeah.
And Yvonne just
Oh,
flirting with
Yeah, everyone
everyone.
By the
making
way-
the lasagna. Dexter announced attempts to launch new business ventures in order to multiply his wealth even more. He announced that he was breaking into international level trade this time. His neighbours became increasingly dissatisfied with him, and they started attempting to give him the worst advice possible, like advising him to invest in terrible business ventures that are doomed to fail, to try and bankrupt him just so he'd be forced to move, because they sort of hated everything that was going on in his house. So the first of these was the recommendation that he sell warming pans. Do you know what warming pans are? They're like
Do you warm them up and then put them in?
You put hot coals in them and
Yeah.
then put them at the end of your bed to warm the bottom of
Exactly.
your bed.
So they're like they're used.
Can I just say that
The
again?
bells are
Yeah.
full.
So you put hot coals in them, and then you would put them at the bottom of your bed to keep your bed warm at night in the
Right.
cold winter months.
Right. So basically, they were used to warm bed sheets. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good invention.
Yeah,
Shame
I
we
mean,
don't have them anymore.
Yeah.
well, I guess we have sort of central heating and stuff now.
Yeah,
Well, we do have
but
that little
central
thing
heating doesn't
called
heat your bed
heating.
sheets.
You know?
Hot water bowl. Yeah, exactly. So they were like flat brass pans. That's a mouthful. They were flat brass pans, and basically it was recommended that he sell them to the West Indies, and of course the West Indies has pretty much hot weather all year
Not
round.
much need for some, warming
Yeah.
pans over there.
Yeah, it'd be like sending a hot water bottle to the Caribbean.
Yeah,
People don't need
yeah.
it. So anyway,
Freezing.
despite that, he decided to buy 42,000 of these things, and obviously people laughed hysterically at him for doing it. But on his arrival to the West Indies, when he very quickly realised that they weren't going to be useful, he just rebranded them as ladles, because there was a big molasses business, like sugar, syrup.
Yeah, basically treacle, isn't it?
Treacle, yeah, exactly. And they realised that they could use them as ladles for that on the plantation, and he sold them all with I think it was like nearly an 80% markup, made a fortune on them, and they were so popular that pretty much everyone bought maybe 3 or 4 of them, and he basically returned with an even greater fortune than he left with. And then he took mittens to the Caribbean.
Why?
Crazy. Why not? And actually ended up bumping into some merchant sailors there who were on their way to Siberia and had just happened to need a ton of mittens. So he sold them. And then someone persuaded him to export coal to Newcastle. And by the way, Newcastle there was an enormous coal mine there. It was like the center of one of the centers of coal mining. So why would they need coal? But it turns out when he got there, there was a miner strike. So all of the mines weren't operating, and he sold all of the coal that he brought to basically plug the gap from the miner strike. Again at a great markup, and returned with 1.5 barrels of silver.
I must say, it's quite satisfying, though, to see the malicious intention of his neighbours against Dexter in the end turn against them.
So by now, he'd actually started to learn the fundamental strategies of marketing and being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So he learned that he could actually inquire what goods were going to be popular.
Yeah.
And buying as much as possible of them, and then basically selling them for double the price. But they were always weird things. I mean, his choices of goods to sell were always just strange.
Didn't he venture into selling whale bones?
Yeah, that's right. So he later travelled back to Boston, and he bought such a large quantity of whale bones that he actually managed to monopolise the entire world market of whale bones, because he literally bought all of the available stock. And whalebone corsets became all the rage in 18th century women's fashion. And he offloaded the whole stock for corsets, also toys as well, children's toys, and even typewriters, being basically called the plastic of the 1800s. And then, this is probably one of the worst, actually. He was known for sometimes using questionable techniques, in inverted commas, to sell his stock. So he bought wholesale Bibles. He bought them at less than half price. And again, went back to the West Indies. And he sent out a text, not a phone text, obviously, a actual text.
Obviously.
Dropped a message.
Yeah.
WhatsApp.
To the boys message. On WhatsApp, yeah.
The West Indies Facebook group.
Yeah, the group chat. Yeah.
Saying that he literally said, all of you must have one Bible in every family, or if not, you will go to hell. And within a few weeks, he'd sold $47,000 worth of Bibles.
God, that's extreme.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
And by the way, this is when he was, again, we were talking about this earlier, that he started to gather a group of friends who were, shall we say, similar spirits, where he lived. So there was John P. John was a rejected schoolmaster who lost his job for basically teaching kids scientific information without having any knowledge on the subject of science. Right, as well as John, there was Madam Hooper, who was another recent rich widow who had become a fortune teller. He had a friend called Molly Pitcher, who actually fired a cannon at the Battle of Monmouth. And,
the first cannon.
Well, yeah, I don't know how she got that gig, but there we are.
Paid someone off.
Yeah, probably. And then she was also the mistress of an army officer who had apparently a double set of teeth, whatever that means.
God.
Oh, imagine brushing those teeth. Imagine trying to floss. Yeah. You'd have to floss between each row.
What if you have braces? Do you need 2 sets of braces?
Do you have like a toothbrush which has 2 heads on it?
Yeah.
I've seen something like that in SpongeBob before.
I can imagine, Timothy Dexter making a good fortune from those.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also apparently his main companion was a chicken.
Wow.
But the best of all of Timmy's friends was a guy called Jonathan Plummer, who was a fishmonger who he met down the local market. So a seller of fish, guy selling fish out of a wheelbarrow, who apparently was also worked in the pornography business. I don't know what that involved in the 19th century. Or 18th, 19th century, yeah. But
just drawings.
But he decided to make this guy, this fish seller, the poet laureate of the Dexter estate. So basically, he asked this guy who was selling fish to be his official poet and write poems about basically how amazing Dexter was. And when he found out that poets were crowned with mistletoe traditionally, he crowned Jonathan Plummer with crown of parsley because that's all he could get his hands on.
I mean, where else would you go to find your poet laureate than down on the fishmonger's market?
Exactly. Yeah, remember the £1 fish guy? He could write a decent lyric. So I've actually got an example here of a poem that was written by the fishmonger. It's actually surprisingly good, if you want to hear it. But this is from the Providence Phoenix, which was a newspaper, and it's December 1804. Talking about, I'll read you a passage from the newspaper. On Monday last arrived in this town the most noble and illustrious Lord Timothy Dexter of Newburyport, Massachusetts, who has since his arrival requested the publication of the following stanzas in this day's paper as a humble tribute to the incomprehensible majesty of his name.
That's a bit extravagant.
It's a mutually exclusive sentence there, but whilst they serve as a brilliant specimen of the gifted talents and admirable sublimity of the laureate from whose pen they flowed, the virtuoso in genealogies and the worshippers of noble rank and boundless fortune may derive a rich and delicious satisfaction from the subject to which they are devoted. Here we are. Advertisement extra of the celebrated Lord Dexter. Right. Lord Dexter is a man of fame, most celebrated is his name. More precious far than gold that's pure, Lord Dexter live forevermore. His noble house, it shines more bright than Lebanon's most pleasant height. Never was one who stepped therein who wanted to come out again. It's my favourite one. His house is filled with sweet perfumes, rich furniture doth fill his rooms. Inside and out it is adorned, and on the top the eagles formed. His house is white and trimmed with green, for many miles it may be seen. It shines as bright as any star, the fame of it has spread afar. Lord Dexter, thou, whose name alone shines brighter than King George's throne, thy name shall stand in books of fame, and princes shall his name proclaim. Lord Dexter hath a coach beside, in pomp and splendour he doth ride. The horses champ the silver bit, and throw the foam around their feet. The images around him stand, for they were made by his command. Looking to see Lord Dexter come, with fixed eyes they see him home. 4 lions stand to guard the door, with their mouths open to devour all enemies who do disturb Lord Dexter or his shady grove. Lord Dexter, like King Solomon, hath gold and silver by the ton, and bells to churches he hath given, to worship the great King of heaven. His mighty deeds, they are so great, he's honoured by both church and state, and when he comes all must give way, to let Lord Dexter bear the sway. When Dexter dies, all things shall droop, Lord East, Lord West, Lord North shall stoop, and then Lord South with pomp shall come, and bear his body to the tomb. His tomb most charming to behold, 1,000 sweets it doth unfold. When Dexter dies, shall willows weep, and mourning friends shall fill the street. May Washington immortal stand, may Jefferson by God's command support the right of all mankind, John Adams not a whit behind. America with all your host, Lord Dexter in a bumper toast. May he enjoy his life in peace, and when he's dead, his name not cease. In heaven may he always reign, for there's no sorrow, sin, nor pain. And to the world I leave the rest, for to pronounce Lord Dexter blessed.
It's quite good.
It's not bad. It's not bad, is it? Oh, by the way,
for a guy that sells fish.
Yeah, I think there's some crazy stuff in there. But there's a lot of rhyming couplets in there that don't appear to rhyme, but that's probably mostly because of the pronunciation of English being different.
Yeah.
So he wrote a book which is called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones.
That's right, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, or Plain Truths in a Homespun Dress.
I prefer Pickle.
So he, despite his lack of penmanship, he basically wanted to immortalise his legacy by writing his own, I guess, sort of a memoir of his life. And it became what is now known as Dexter's masterwork. It's a 24-page book written in 1802, and it basically talks about a whole range of things. Mostly his criticism of the Pope and the clergy, politicians, and probably most of all his wife. The book at the time by critics was received pretty badly. I mean, they actually called it trash. I didn't know people called things trash in the 19th century, but they said it was trash. Laden with random capitalization. By the way, people say random capitalization, but it's actually not. I'll get into that.
We'll get to your theory on that later.
Yeah, we will indeed. And it's got nonsensical grammar and sentence structure. It's devoid entirely of punctuation. Basically jumbled, incomprehensible writing. And he signs off every paragraph with his name. There's a lot of very strange...
I'll just read the first few lines of this. I'm the first Lord in the United States of America, now of Newburyport. It is the voice of the people, and I can't help it, and so let it go. Now as I must be Lord there, will follow many more lords pretty soon, for it don't hurt a cat, nor the mouse, nor the sun, nor the water, nor the ear. Then go on, all is easy, now bonds broken, all is well, all in love. Now, I could go on.
Yeah,
but
basically, it's a bit like reading a 19th century James Joyce. I mean, that poem was like reading, Dr. Seuss, like The Cat in the Hat. This is not as easy.
Exactly. So the reason it might have sounded very strange when I was reading that is because there's no punctuation. So if you're reading it for the first time, it's hard to know how to articulate it.
This is one of my favourite passages. So he's talking about his house and people's treatment of him as a person. This is one of the best similes ever written. I was to make my enemies grin in time, like a cat over a hot pudding, and go away and hang their heads down, like a dog been after sheep guilty stop. See, I am afraid I write too harsh. He realised that when noblemen released a book that was something of a memoir or an autobiography, they would give free copies out as gifts to increase their readership rather than selling them. So he went out just onto the street, onto the roadside, handing out random copies of his book, and people got talking and very quickly realised that in a way it was kind of its own unique form of genius, and it became so popular and the demand was so high that he printed a second edition. So his response to the criticism of lack of punctuation in the book was an extra page at the end with 13 lines purely just of punctuation marks. And there's an instruction to the reader at the bottom saying that the reader should pepper and salt them as they please, i.e. there's your full stop so you can put them where you want. Basically, stick it where the sun don't shine. The author Irving Wallace, much later, described it as an egotistical, opinionated, coarse defence of Dexter, by Dexter, against all enemies who were anti-Dexter. My mum, actually, who's read quite a lot into... She's a TA who deals with a lot of special needs students, and she's read... Because my brother is dyslexic and dyspraxic, and she's read a lot into the subject. She's convinced... A lot of people claim in this that Dexter was basically just ignorant or an idiot or uneducated and couldn't spell. But my mum's convinced that he had some kind of severe form of dyslexia because the book bears all the hallmarks of someone who's dyslexic. Like, it's actually consistent capitalization of words, i.e. generally all words beginning with an L, a capital, or a C or a D, which could be linked to the spelling of his name or what he was taught, the way he was taught to write. But also the spelling is quite phonetic, and it bears sort of all the classic examples of misspelling that dyslexic people make. So, as I was saying before, Dexter was always worried about his peers' respect for him, and he put that to the ultimate test when he decided to fake his own death. So he prepared for a grand, lavish funeral celebration. he built a big tomb in the basement of his summer house. He hired the best woodworker, best cabinet maker in the whole of Massachusetts to handcraft a coffin from the finest mahogany. So that he even practiced sleeping in it. He got his most trusted servants to help him organise a fake funeral and send out the invites. Yeah. He got his family in on it, so his kids and his wife knew, and he told them to basically act sad.
And his reasoning for faking his own funeral was just to see how many people would turn up.
Yeah, and to see how people would react, basically.
Wow, that's.
I mean, he actually had a fallout with his wife because she didn't look sad enough. That's another story. But yeah, basically, it turns out 3,000 people turned up to his funeral.
That's
so
a good
they had
turnout.
a big party, free alcohol, exotic liquors, and wine.
What if they all just went for the free bar?
It's quite possible.
Well, quite possible.
But at the same time, then they just look bad, right? So he won. He wins either way. But apparently he was watching this from under the floorboards. It's like a scene from Pirates of the Caribbean.
Poking up the floorboards.
Yeah, and
you've got one of those like periscope things that
just like
looks around.
Well, he actually began calling his wife a ghost after that. So he sort of wanted to disassociate with her. So he told people that she was dead and that the woman walking around the house was her ghost haunting him.
Oh, okay.
He basically refused to acknowledge her existence.
So they fell out. They separated.
Yeah, it's sort of hard. It seems like a strange relationship, but I think maybe there was something weird going on.
Yeah. When he passed away, he did make a very generous will to all of his close family.
Shared out the estate between his friends, family, kids, his wife, and so on. And this was in 1806 that he died, October of 1806, at 59, the age of 59. Just a few years after publishing Pickle for the Knowing Ones.
Wow.
And he died for real, by the way, this time.
This time for real.
Fake death. Later, biographer Samuel Knapp, who wrote a biography about him, wrote that Dexter had a way of his own, which he disdained to copy or suffer to be copied. In short, he was a living exception to all general rules and a living contradiction to all maxims of human wisdom.
Awesome.
So his statues outside his house were damaged in a storm and sold at auction, and the ones that weren't sold were burned in 1815. The house eventually became a tavern, and then it changed owners. I think it's now a hotel, or was a hotel for a while. It actually was set on fire by painters. They decided it'd be a good idea to remove paint by burning it. And it was eventually taken on board by the Preservation of New England Architecture, who were like a society devoted to reconstituting historical architecture, and they rebuilt the mansion. So it's there today. You can see the Timothy Dexter house. The statue's obviously no longer there.
Wow. So, for those interested, you can go to www.lordtimothydexter.com to read his eccentric writings.
And you can also see a biography on there, although I'm quite convinced that the people running that website are slightly as nutty as he was.
Most likely, yeah. Probably distant relations.
So thank you for joining us this week on the Mockery Cushion. If you liked what you heard, give us a like on Facebook.
Follow us on Instagram.
And follow us on Twitter.
Or you can listen to our previous episodes on YouTube as well. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me. Aren't mammals the only creatures that have necks?
No, insects have necks. Like an ant or a grasshopper or a.
No, I think I'm pretty sure humans are the only creatures that have necks.
No,
they're mammals.
No.
Oh yeah, giraffes.
Yeah, but
That doesn't really count as a neck, does it?
It's not a neck, is it? Really? I mean,
it's just an extendable
neck
appendage.
Oh yeah.